What if everything you thought you knew about the birth of democracy was only half the story? We've all been taught that democracy began in ancient Athens, a shining beacon of citizen rule in a world dominated by kings and emperors. But here's the startling truth: Athens wasn't alone. Across the globe, long before the modern era, cultures we rarely associate with democracy were experimenting with collective governance in ways that would astonish you. From the bustling trade cities of the Indus Valley to the nomadic tribes of the Eurasian steppes, ancient people were forging systems where voices were heard, decisions were shared, and power wasn't just handed down, it was built from the ground up. Picture this: a world where fishermen in coastal villages voted on fishing rights, where merchant guilds in Mesopotamia elected their leaders, and where tribal councils in Africa debated laws under the open sky. These weren't isolated exceptions, they were part of a tapestry of democratic practices that history books have often overlooked. And the most surprising part: many of these systems thrived centuries before Athens ever held its first assembly. They were adaptable, innovative, and deeply rooted in their cultures, proving that the human desire for fair governance is as old as civilization itself. This journey isn't just about uncovering forgotten chapters of history, it's about redefining what democracy really means. Over the next few minutes, we'll explore 20 astonishing examples of ancient democracy that will challenge everything you thought you knew. You'll see how these systems rose, how they fell, and how their echoes still shape our world today. By the time we're done, you'll never look at democracy or ancient history the same way again. So let's step off the beaten path and discover the untold stories of how ordinary people, in extraordinary times, dared to govern themselves. The first stop on our journey takes us to the banks of the ancient Indus River, where one of history's greatest urban mysteries holds a tantalizing clue about early democracy. While modern history books focus on Mesopotamia and Egypt as cradles of civilization, the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro tell a strikingly different story. Walk through these carefully planned streets today, and you'll notice something peculiar. There are no towering ziggurats dedicated to gods, no sprawling palaces for kings, no monuments celebrating individual rulers. Instead, you find wide streets laid out in precise grids, advanced drainage systems that served entire neighborhoods, and standardized weights that suggest fair trade practices across the city. These aren't the marks of a top-down autocracy, they're the fingerprints of collective decision-making. What really sets the Indus Valley apart is how its cities functioned without the usual trappings of centralized power. While other ancient civilizations built monumental architecture to glorify their rulers, the people of Mohenjo-Daro invested in public goods that benefited everyone equally. Their great bath wasn't reserved for elites, it was a communal space. Their granaries weren't private storehouses, they were carefully placed to serve the whole city. Even their housing shows remarkable equality, with most homes having similar access to water and sanitation. This wasn't just good urban planning, it was a society that valued shared responsibility over individual dominance. The most fascinating part: we might be looking at one of humanity's first experiments with representative governance. Archaeologists have found evidence of neighborhood assemblies and craft guilds that likely had a say in how the city was run. Picture artisans, merchants, and farmers gathering to debate infrastructure projects or trade policies centuries before the Greek agora became famous for such discussions. The Indus script still hasn't been deciphered, but if those symbols ever yield their secrets, they might reveal records of votes taken, compromises made, and communities working together. For now, these silent ruins stand as a powerful reminder that democracy isn't just a Western invention. It's a human impulse that has emerged independently across cultures and millennia. This discovery turns our traditional timeline of political evolution upside down. While we often assume that early societies naturally progressed from tribes to kingdoms to empires, the Indus Valley suggests there was always another path, one where people found ways to share power rather than concentrate it. Their system may not have looked like our modern democracies, but in its emphasis on collective welfare and equitable resource distribution, it planted seeds of an idea that would keep reappearing throughout history. The real tragedy is that we may never know exactly how their governance worked, but what we can see tells us that our democratic roots run deeper and stretch farther back in time than we ever imagined. Now let's travel from the egalitarian streets of Mohenjo-Daro to the bustling marketplaces of ancient Mesopotamia, where a different kind of democracy was taking shape, one built not in assembly halls but in the shadow of merchant stalls. While we think of Sumerian city-states as hierarchical societies ruled by god-kings, clay tablets from Ur and Lagash tell a surprising story of shared power. These records show merchant guilds, coalitions of traders, artisans, and ship owners holding extraordinary sway over civic life. Picture the scene. In smoke-filled rooms near the docks, wealthy spice dealers and textile merchants debating tax rates, while scribes etched their agreements into wet clay. This wasn't just business, it was politics by another name. What made Mesopotamia's merchant democracy so revolutionary was its blend of commerce and civic participation. Unlike later Greek democracy that excluded traders and artisans, Sumerian cities recognized that economic power deserved political voice. When a king needed funds for a new temple or canal, he didn't just issue decrees, he negotiated with merchant assemblies. Tablets from Lagash detail how these guilds could veto royal projects, demand infrastructure improvements, even influence foreign policy. One remarkable record describes merchants refusing to fund a war until the king improved harbor facilities, an ancient example of corporate lobbying with public benefits. The system worked because it balanced competing interests. Kings maintained religious authority and military control, but merchants held the purse strings. This created checks and balances long before Montesquieu theorized them. Take the city of Ur during its peak as a trade hub. When the ruling dynasty tried imposing harsh taxes, merchant guilds organized what tablets call the Great Withholding, essentially an economic strike that forced compromise. Their influence extended to lawmaking too, with surviving legal codes showing clear marks of commercial interests, from standardized contracts to protections against fraud. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of Mesopotamia's merchant democracy is how its model traveled through time. Centuries later, Phoenician city-states adopted similar systems where trade councils governed alongside kings. The tradition continued through medieval Europe, where the merchant republics of Venice and Genoa owed more to Sumerian bazaars than Athenian philosophy. Even today, traces survive in modern trade associations and chambers of commerce, proof that when ancient merchants sat down to debate taxes and tariffs, they were inventing forms of governance that would outlast empires. What began as pragmatic deals between kings and traders became one of humanity's first experiments in balancing economic power with political participation, a lesson our modern democracies are still learning. Far north of the Mediterranean's marble-columned assemblies beneath the oak canopies of ancient Europe, an entirely different democratic tradition was taking root. The Celtic tribes of the Iron Age practiced a form of grassroots governance that would have baffled both Athenian philosophers and Roman senators. Their system revolved around the thing, not an object, but a vibrant assembly where free tribesmen gathered to resolve disputes, declare wars, and shape their collective future. Imagine the scene: warriors leaning on their shields, farmers still smelling of earth, and craftsmen with calloused hands, all standing as equals in a sacred grove, debating fiercely under the open sky. What made Celtic democracy so remarkable was its fluid structure. Unlike Athens with its fixed citizen roles or Rome with its rigid senate, Celtic tribes recognized leadership as temporary and situational. A man might guide his people in battle one season, then return to being an ordinary farmer the next. Their laws weren't carved in stone but carried in memory, passed down through generations of oral poets who could recite centuries of precedents. Julius Caesar, while conquering Gaul, wrote with grudging admiration about these assemblies where even kings could be overruled by popular will. In his own words, the Celts believed no issue, public or private, could be settled without a full gathering of the tribe. The system thrived on balance and accountability. Land disputes were settled by elected judges who traveled between villages. Major decisions required consensus building, with elders moderating debates until agreement emerged. Most strikingly, Celtic women often held voting rights and leadership roles, something unthinkable in contemporary Athens. Historical accounts tell of warrior queens like Boudica, who rallied tribes through persuasion as much as authority, proving power flowed from consent rather than birthright. Rome's conquest nearly erased this tradition, but its spirit survived in the unlikeliest of places. When Norse settlers reached Iceland in the 9th century, they carried echoes of the Thing system across the sea. The Althing they established in the year 930, set against the dramatic backdrop of Iceland's rift valleys, became the world's oldest continuous parliament. Just like their Celtic predecessors, early Icelanders gathered annually to hear laws recited, settle feuds, and elect temporary leaders. That this system endured for over 1,000 years while Rome's empire crumbled suggests there was profound wisdom in those ancient forest assemblies. The true legacy of Celtic democracy lies in its radical flexibility. Where Greek systems often excluded non-citizens and Rome centralized power, the Things allowed diverse voices to shape decisions through face-to-face deliberation. Modern town halls, Swiss cantons, even some digital communities unknowingly mirror this ancient approach. Perhaps that's why the idea feels so familiar today, because long before political theorists wrote treatises on representation, ordinary people beneath the oaks were already practicing democracy's most essential truth, that governance works best when it grows from the ground up. While Rome's republic gets all the glory in history books, its greatest rival Carthage was quietly perfecting a political system so balanced, it made Roman senators nervous. Imagine a bustling port city where merchant princes ruled, but where even the most celebrated generals could be hauled before a citizen's tribunal if they overstepped. That was Carthage at its peak, a Mediterranean powerhouse that mixed aristocratic control with surprising democratic safeguards. At the heart of it all stood the Council of 104, an elected body with teeth sharp enough to bite back at military overreach. Picture this: after Hannibal's legendary victory at Cannae, where he annihilated 80,000 Roman troops, he still had to answer to this council for his next move. Try imagining a Roman consul facing that kind of accountability. What set Carthage apart was its ingenious system of checks and balances. While wealthy merchant families dominated politics, much like modern corporate boards, they governed through assemblies where citizens could voice grievances. Military leaders, no matter how victorious, had to justify their campaigns and spending. Records describe returning admirals being questioned like modern CEOs at a shareholder meeting, forced to account for every coin spent on ships and mercenaries. This wasn't just bureaucracy, It was a radical constraint on the kind of warlordism that would later doom Rome. Even more striking, Carthaginian law required unanimous council votes for death penalties, ensuring no single faction could wield unchecked judicial power. The system's sophistication becomes clear when you compare it to Rome's trajectory. While Carthage kept its generals on a short leash, Rome's republican ideals crumbled as military heroes like Pompey and Caesar amassed personal armies. Had Carthage prevailed in the Punic Wars, the Mediterranean might have developed along profoundly different lines, a world where elected councils checked military adventures rather than glorified them. Consider how differently history could have unfolded if Rome had adopted Carthage's model. No imperial dictatorships, no Praetorian Guard auctioning off the throne, just a slow evolution toward broader representation. Yet Carthage's greatest innovation might have been its economic democracy. Unlike Athens, where only landowners could vote, Carthage extended political influence to anyone who contributed to its commercial empire. Ship captains, dockworkers, and craftsmen all had avenues to petition the council. Surviving trade contracts show clauses protecting small businesses from elite monopolies, an ancient version of antitrust laws. This pragmatic approach created stability. While Greek city-states fractured under class warfare, Carthage thrived for centuries by balancing oligarchy with grassroots participation. The tragedy is that we know so little about Carthage's inner workings after Rome salted its ruins, but fragments suggest its system influenced later trading powers, from Venice's merchant councils to the Hanseatic League's guild governments. Even today, echoes linger in corporate republics like Singapore, where economic prowess and political control intertwine. Carthage proves democracy isn't just about idealistic equality sometimes. It's about building systems where even the powerful must answer to the people who fund them. Had those salted fields in North Africa been left to flourish, we might be studying Carthaginian democracy as the model, not its Roman conquerors. 500 years before the Common Era, while Athens was still ruled by aristocratic clans and Rome was just a village on the Tiber, an entirely different democratic experiment was unfolding under the shade of bodhi trees. Buddhist monastic communities known as Sanghas developed governance methods so refined they would make modern parliamentarians take notes. Picture this: groups of monks and nuns gathering after their alms rounds, sitting cross-legged not just to meditate, but to vote on community rules using colored sticks, white for approval, black for dissent. Their procedures weren't just administrative, they were spiritual practices, treating collective decision-making as sacred as chanting sutras. What made the Sangha system revolutionary was its radical commitment to consensus. Unlike Athenian democracy, where majority rule could override minority voices, Buddhist communities required near-unanimous agreement on critical matters, especially disciplinary rules. If even one member objected, deliberations continued until compromises were found. This wasn't bureaucratic gridlock, it was a profound recognition that true harmony required every voice to feel heard. Their rulebooks, preserved in the Vinaya Pitaka, read like ancient manuals for conflict resolution, detailing how to mediate disputes through patient dialogue rather than force. Monks who broke rules weren't punished unilaterally but underwent a collective rehabilitation process voted on by their peers, an early form of restorative justice. The system's brilliance became evident when Emperor Ashoka adopted its principles after his bloody Kalinga conquest. Horrified by the violence he'd unleashed, Ashoka didn't just convert to Buddhism, he transformed his empire's governance. His famous rock edicts describe how he replaced top-down decrees with public debates, sending out officials not to collect taxes but to listen to grievances. One remarkable inscription orders administrators to consult local assemblies before implementing policies, declaring the people's welfare must be secured through their participation. Suddenly, the Sanghas consensus model was scaling up to manage millions, proving spirituality could shape statecraft. But perhaps the Sangha's most enduring innovation was its mobility. Unlike city-states tied to geography, these democratic communities traveled light. As Buddhism spread along Silk Road trade routes, so did its governance methods. Chinese pilgrims' accounts describe Central Asian monasteries where translators from a dozen cultures debated translation protocols through structured voting. Tibetan records show monastic universities using elaborate ballot systems to appoint teachers, sometimes debating for weeks until perfect consensus emerged. This portable democracy thrived precisely because it wasn't about controlling territory, but about cultivating collective wisdom. The legacy lives on in surprising places. Modern consensus-based movements from Quaker meetings to Scandinavian labor negotiations unconsciously echo these ancient practices. Even the United Nations Security Council, with its emphasis on unanimous resolutions, bears faint traces of Ashoka's adapted system. Yet the Sangha's true lesson isn't about procedure, but about intention. Their meetings always began with mindfulness, recognizing that good decisions require both sharp minds and calm hearts. In an age where democracies often feel fractured and reactive, that ancient fusion of inner reflection and outer deliberation might be exactly what we need to rediscover. Long before European settlers set foot on North American soil, a revolutionary political experiment was already thriving in the forests of what we now call New York State. The Hordnocony, known to many as the Iroquois Confederacy, had perfected a system of governance so advanced that when Benjamin Franklin encountered it in the 1700s, he wrote letters urging colonial leaders to study it closely. Picture this: 5 nations, later 6, who had once warred bitterly, now gathering around a central fire where decisions required not just majority votes, but complete consensus. Clan mothers respected elder women, selected male leaders, and could remove them if they failed their duties, while separate councils handled domestic and foreign affairs with meticulous division of power. This wasn't just a peace treaty, it was a full-fledged constitution called the Great Law of Peace, passed down through intricate wampum belts that encoded its principles in symbolic beads. What made the Iroquois system extraordinary was its blend of democracy and checks on power. Unlike European governments of the time, where authority flowed top-down from kings, the Hordnocony saw leadership as a temporary responsibility rather than a right. Chiefs earned their positions through merit and maintained them only as long as they demonstrated wisdom and fairness. The clan mothers' role as nominators and overseers created a unique gender balance. Women couldn't sit in council themselves, but their influence ensured leaders remained accountable to the community's needs. Historical records describe clan mothers summoning chiefs for correction like schoolchildren, reminding them, "You are only the voice of the people." The system's sophistication shines when you examine its structural innovations. The Confederacy functioned through tiered councils. Local village groups handled everyday disputes, while national and grand councils addressed broader issues. Crucially, all decisions required unanimous agreement among nations, forcing thorough debate until solutions satisfied everyone. This prevented larger nations like the Mohawk from dominating smaller ones like the Cayuga, a concept startlingly similar to the equal state representation later adopted in the U.S. Senate. When disputes arose, special pine tree chiefs, known for their impartiality, mediated conflicts, foreshadowing modern arbitration systems. Franklin's fascination wasn't mere curiosity. As early as 1751, he published excerpts of Iroquois speeches praising their unity, contrasting it with colonial infighting. Later, during the Continental Congress's struggles to draft the Articles of Confederation, he openly referenced the Iroquois model as proof that diverse entities could govern collectively without surrendering autonomy. While scholars debate how directly the Great Law influenced the U.S. Constitution, parallels are undeniable. Federalism balancing local and central power, impeachment processes echoing clan mothers' recall authority, even the very idea of a multi-state union bound by written principles. Yet the greatest tragedy lies in what wasn't borrowed. The Iroquois system's environmental provisions requiring 7-generation impact assessments for major decisions could have reshaped America's relationship with land. Their emphasis on restorative justice over punitive measures offered alternatives to European legal traditions. Most strikingly, their concept of leadership as service rather than privilege presented a radical counterpoint to the European aristocratic mindset. That these ideas were overlooked speaks volumes about the selective vision of early American leaders. Today, the Confederacy still governs portions of upstate New York and Canada, making it the oldest continuing participatory democracy on Earth. Its endurance through colonization, forced removals, and cultural suppression stands as testament to the resilience of indigenous political thought. Modern movements for cooperative governance, from eco-villages to worker collectives, unknowingly echo principles the Hordnocony refined over 1,000 years ago. Their greatest lesson wasn't just about structures or processes, but about a fundamental truth: that sustainable power must grow from consensus, balance, and reverence for those who will inherit the consequences of today's decisions. High on Iceland's windswept lava plains, where glaciers tower over steaming hot springs, one of history's most improbable democracies took root. While medieval Europe bowed to feudal lords and divine right monarchs, Icelandic settlers crafted something radical: a society where laws belonged not to rulers but to the land itself. The Althing, established in the year 930, wasn't just an assembly. It was the beating heart of a free state that turned Viking individualism into collective governance. Picture this: every summer, farmers from across the island converging on the Rift Valley of Thingvellir, setting up wool tents amid the echoing cliffs as their chosen law speaker stood on the law rock to recite the entire legal code from memory. No police, no army, just the shared understanding that order came from participation, not punishment. What made Iceland's system extraordinary was how it harnessed competition without collapsing into chaos. Local chieftains called Godar held influence not by commanding troops, but by offering services, arbitrating disputes, hosting feasts, even lending tools. A Godi who grew too authoritarian risked losing followers, as free farmers could switch allegiances at will. This created a marketplace of leadership where power flowed to those who served their communities best. Surviving sagas describe cunning Godar winning debates through eloquence rather than force, persuading assemblies with carefully woven arguments instead of threats. When blood feuds erupted, as they inevitably did, the Althing provided neutral ground where sworn enemies could negotiate reparations through complex systems of Wergild man price payments, preventing cycles of violence from spiraling out of control. The system's fragility was also its genius. With no executive branch to enforce rulings, compliance depended entirely on collective buy-in. A farmer who refused to pay a fine might find himself excluded from trade networks or even declared an outlaw, a fate worse than death in this harsh landscape. Yet this very lack of centralized coercion fostered remarkable legal creativity. Cases were judged by panels of neighbors, precedents were meticulously recorded in the sagas, and new laws required approval at the Althing before being added to the law speaker's recitation. One particularly Icelandic solution to corruption, requiring all legal arguments to be delivered outdoors in the hearing of hundreds, making backroom deals nearly impossible. For 3 centuries, this experiment defied expectations. While Normandy became a duchy and Norway consolidated under kings, Iceland's farmers preserved their peculiar republic through blizzards, volcanic eruptions, and clan warfare. Its eventual submission to Norway in the 13th century came not through military defeat, but through internal rivalries exploited by a cunning monarch. Yet the Althing's legacy never truly died. When Iceland regained independence in 1944, it resurrected the ancient assembly site for its modern constitution. Today's Icelandic parliament still bears the name Althingi, and citizens regularly use national referendums to challenge elite decisions. A direct line back to those Viking-era assemblies where every free farmer had a voice. The deeper lesson lies in how this medieval democracy functioned without the pillars we consider essential. No standing army enforced order, no bureaucracy collected taxes, no police patrolled the fjords. Instead, trust became the currency of governance. When modern democracies grapple with polarization and disengagement, Iceland's history whispers an alternative, that the strongest laws aren't those written on parchment, but those woven into the fabric of shared identity. Those Viking settlers understood something we're still rediscovering, that true rule of the people doesn't come from above, but from the willingness of ordinary people to show up, debate fiercely, and take responsibility for the society they build together. When European explorers first encountered the great kingdoms of Africa, they made a fatal assumption that societies without marble-columned parliaments couldn't possibly understand democracy. Nothing could be further from the truth. Across the continent, from the dense forests of Nigeria to the sweeping savannas of southern Africa, sophisticated systems of consensus-based governance had been flourishing for centuries. Take the Igbo people of what is now Nigeria, whose village assemblies operated on a principle that would baffle most modern politicians. No decision was valid until every dissenting voice had been heard and addressed. Their Ofo system gave symbolic staffs to lineage heads not as tools of authority, but as reminders that leadership meant listening first, commanding last. What set these African systems apart was their ingenious blend of hierarchy and horizontal participation. Among the Tswana people of Botswana, Kegosi chiefs held considerable influence, but they governed alongside public assemblies called Kegotla, where any adult, man or woman, could challenge proposals. Records from early 19th century describe heated debates over land distribution, with cattle herders and crop growers negotiating usage, right through marathon sessions that continued until compromises satisfied all factions. Unlike Western majoritarian systems where 51% could override 49%, these forums required solutions that minimized discontent, a radical approach we're only now rediscovering through concepts like consensus democracy and participatory budgeting. The most striking feature was how these societies institutionalized checks on power. The Ashanti Empire's famed golden stool wasn't just a royal symbol, it embodied the idea that rulers governed by popular consent. Chiefs who violated this trust faced destooling ceremonies where elders literally removed them from their stools amid public rebuke. Similarly, the Yoruba Oyo Mesi Council could reject a king's edicts if they contradicted community values, while the Lozi of Zambia had a dedicated people's representative whose sole job was to critique the monarch's decisions openly. European accounts from the colonial era often express shock at how freely commoners corrected their leaders, a level of accountability unimaginable in contemporaneous European monarchies. These systems weren't fragile experiments, they sustained complex societies for generations. The Kingdom of Buganda developed a cabinet-like system with specialized ministers overseeing everything from naval affairs to public works, all subject to clan oversight. Mali's legendary Mansa Musa, often reduced to a caricature of wealth in Western textbooks, actually governed through a council of guild representatives that included artisans, merchants, and even enslaved advisors. Portuguese traders in 15th century Benin City marveled at orderly streets policed by guilds rather than soldiers, and at palace walls adorned not with conquest scenes, but with depictions of judicial proceedings. The tragedy lies in how colonialism disrupted these traditions. British indirect rule artificially empowered certain chiefs while dismantling accountability structures, creating the very dictatorships Europeans would later claim were natural to Africa. French assimilation policies dismissed consensus models as primitive, imposing top-down administration that silenced village assemblies. Yet fragments survived, but Tswana's modern Kegotla system still informs local governance, while Rwanda's traditional Gakaka courts were adapted to address genocide aftermath. Even South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission owed philosophical debts to Ubuntu principles emphasizing restorative justice. What modern democracies might learn from these systems is profound. Where Western politics often fuels division by forcing binary choices, African consensus models sought unifying solutions. Where our systems tolerate minority disenfranchisement as inevitable, theirs treated persistent dissent as governance failure. Most importantly, they remind us that democracy isn't about structures imported from particular regions. It's about the universal human instinct to have a say in the rules we live by. The real surprise isn't that Africa had democracy before colonization. It's that we're still catching up to the sophistication of what they built. While Carthage's democratic structures dazzled the ancient world, its Phoenician ancestors had already perfected a model of governance where commerce and collective rule intertwined seamlessly. Centuries before Athenian democracy emerged, the bustling ports of Tyre and Sidon operated on a principle modern corporations might envy. Economic power demanded political participation. Their secret, elected officials called Suffites, a term meaning judges, but functioning more like CEO presidents who governed alongside kings, creating a delicate balance between monarchy and merchant republic. Picture the scene. Wealthy shipowners and dye merchants Tyre's famed purple dye made fortunes gathering in cedar-paneled halls to nominate these Suffites, knowing their city's prosperity depended on keeping both royal ambition and populist unrest in check. What made this system revolutionary was its portability. As Phoenician traders established colonies across the Mediterranean, they didn't just export goods, they transplanted their hybrid governance. Gadia modern Cadiz became a mirror of Tyre's institutions, with Suffites overseeing trade agreements while elected councils managed civic affairs. Inscriptions from the 8th century BCE describe how these overseas settlements replicated the mother city's checks and balances, ensuring no single faction, whether royal, priestly, or mercantile, could monopolize power. Even more striking, some colonies developed rotating suffeetships, preventing any individual from amassing too much influence. This wasn't just practical politics, it was an early blueprint for federal systems where dispersed communities shared core values while adapting to local needs. The Phoenician approach thrived on pragmatism rather than ideology. Unlike Greek city-states that idealized citizenship, Tyre and Sidon welcomed anyone who contributed to their maritime economy. Surviving records mention Suffites of Egyptian, Cypriot, and even Greek origin, a multiculturalism unthinkable in contemporary Athens. Their laws prioritized contract enforcement and debt arbitration, creating stability that attracted traders from across the ancient world. One clay tablet from Ugarit details how a Suffite mediated a dispute between Syrian and Cretan merchants, ruling based on evidence rather than nationality, an early example of transnational commercial law. Carthage's later dominance obscured this legacy, but traces lingered in unexpected places. When Rome conquered Sardinia, they discovered Phoenician-derived towns still electing annual magistrates called judices, a direct evolution of the Sufite tradition. Some scholars argue Venice's doge system, with its blend of ceremonial monarchy and merchant oligarchy, unknowingly echoed these Levantine precedents. Even the Hanseatic League's merchant assemblies, which shaped medieval northern Europe, followed a similar logic, that those who bore economic risks deserved a say in governance. The real tragedy is how history remembers the Phoenicians. Reduced to purple dye merchants in most textbooks, their true innovation wasn't in products but in processes, proving that democracy could flourish without agrarian foundations or warrior cultures. Their model demonstrated that seas could connect as effectively as walls divided, that shared prosperity could be a stronger glue than shared ethnicity. In an era where trade wars and supply chain politics dominate headlines, the Phoenicians' greatest lesson might be this: when governance aligns with economic reality, it doesn't just survive, it sails across centuries, finding safe harbor in societies far removed from its origins. Beneath the shade of Sri Lanka's towering palm trees, where emerald rice paddies stretch toward the horizon, lies one of history's most enduring democratic secrets. For over 2,000 years, while kingdoms rose and fell, ordinary farmers in this island nation perfected a system of grassroots governance so effective that it literally kept their civilization alive. The Gamsabha village assemblies etched into ancient stone inscriptions weren't just meetings. They were the lifeblood of communities that managed everything from water rights to criminal disputes with astonishing sophistication. Picture this: monsoons drenching the land, and farmers gathering not just to celebrate the rains, but to vote on how to allocate every precious drop through networks of tanks and canals they maintained together. What made these micro-democracies revolutionary was their fusion of ecological wisdom and collective decision-making. Unlike top-down empires where rulers dictated agricultural policies from distant capitals, Sri Lankan villages entrusted water management to those who knew it best, the cultivators themselves. Inscriptions detail how Gamsab has elected water trustees responsible for fair distribution, with strict penalties for hoarding. One 12th century record describes a farmer fined double his harvest for stealing irrigation turns, while another praises a village that rebuilt its tank through voluntary labor quotas voted into law. This wasn't just local government, it was survival strategy codified into custom, where every voice mattered because every hand nurtured the land. The system's brilliance lay in its nested hierarchies. Individual households maintained small tanks, clusters of families managed medium reservoirs, and entire villages governed large-scale projects through consensus. Disputes between villages, they'd convene regional sabhas where representatives negotiated water-sharing pacts that sometimes lasted centuries. Archaeologists have found stone markers along ancient canals bearing phrases like, "This flow rate agreed upon by the four villages," with precise volumetric measurements, proof that oral agreements were formalized into lasting infrastructure. Modern hydrologists marvel at how these democratic decisions created irrigation networks so precise, they outperformed 20th century engineering in some areas. But the Gamsabha's reach extended far beyond water. Court records preserved on copper plates show assemblies adjudicating everything from cattle theft to marital disputes, with juries drawn from multiple castes to ensure impartiality. Remarkably, women often participated directly. A 7th century inscription from Anuradhapura lists a female landowner arguing her case before the assembly, while another mentions a widow elected to oversee temple donations. This wasn't theoretical equality, it was practical inclusion born from recognizing that communal survival required all available wisdom, regardless of gender or status. The true test of any democracy is endurance, and here, Sri Lanka's village sabhas set a staggering precedent. While the Roman Republic collapsed after 5 centuries and Athens' democracy faltered repeatedly, these micro-assemblies persisted through dynastic changes, foreign invasions, even colonial rule. Portuguese accounts from the 16th century describe baffled European soldiers encountering villages that still operated under ancient codes despite royal edicts from Kandy. British administrators in the 1800s, intent on imposing centralized control, were forced to adapt existing water councils into their bureaucracy because nothing they designed worked half as well. Today, as climate change strains modern water governance, development experts are turning to this ancient model for inspiration. The tank cascade system, that intricate web of reservoirs and channels managed collectively for millennia, was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Practice in 2017. Farmers in dry zones still revive centuries-old tanks using inscriptions as blueprints, proving that democratic decisions carved in stone can outlast steel and concrete megaprojects. Perhaps their greatest lesson isn't about scale, but about connection, that when people directly govern the resources their lives depend on, they craft solutions no distant authority could ever conceive. In an age of top-down climate policies failing to meet urgent needs, those Sri Lankan farmers whisper across the centuries that survival begins not with decrees, but with villagers gathering under the banyan tree, debating passionately and deciding together. High above the Oaxacan Valley, where clouds cling to ancient stone platforms, the ruins of Monte Albán whisper a tantalizing possibility that democracy might have flourished in Mesoamerica centuries before Spanish galleons appeared on the horizon. Unlike its contemporary Teotihuacan, where towering pyramids celebrated god-kings, this Zapotec city's very architecture suggests power was shared rather than seized. Walk through the sprawling central plaza today, and you'll notice something peculiar. No single palace dominates the space. Instead, platforms radiate outward like spokes in a wheel, each seemingly designed for equal representation. Archaeologists believe these structures hosted council meetings where elite families negotiated decisions, their debates echoing across the valley below, a far cry from the silent obedience expected in autocratic societies. The evidence lies in what's missing as much as what remains. While other Mesoamerican cities glorified warriors in vivid murals, Monte Albán's art tells a different story. Stone carvings depict processions of figures wearing distinct insignia, likely representatives of noble houses standing shoulder to shoulder without hierarchical scaling. One famous relief shows costumed elites passing bundles between them, a possible metaphor for exchanging responsibilities. Even the so-called danzantes figures, once thought to portray tortured prisoners, are now reinterpreted by some scholars as council members captured mid-debate, their dynamic poses suggesting animated discussion rather than submission. These visual clues paint a picture of governance through negotiation rather than decree. What truly sets Monte Albán apart is how its political structure evolved alongside its urban design. Early levels show centralized authority, but as the city expanded between 200 and 600 CE, power appears to have diffused. Excavations reveal formerly residential compounds transformed into administrative complexes, suggesting noble families incorporated governance into daily life. Imagine living in a neighborhood where your local leader's house doubled as a civic forum, where policy wasn't handed down from an isolated ruler but hammered out in courtyards smelling of corn stew and copal incense. This decentralization proved remarkably stable. Monte Albán thrived for over 1,000 years, outlasting neighboring states that rose and fell through military conquest. The mystery deepens when you examine the Zapotec writing system. Unlike Mayan glyphs that often chronicle individual rulers' exploits, Monte Albán's inscriptions emphasize collective events. One deciphered stela records the tying of the years ceremony performed by multiple officials simultaneously, while another mentions decisions made by the people of the sky, possibly a term for the ruling council. Linguists note the frequent use of plural verb forms in political contexts, hinting at shared agency. If more glyphs could be fully translated, they might confirm what the archaeology implies, that this was a society where governance meant finding consensus among competing factions. The implications challenge everything we thought we knew about pre-Columbian politics. While textbooks often depict Mesoamerican civilizations as rigid theocracies, Monte Albán suggests alternatives existed societies where elite competition channeled into structured collaboration rather than violent succession crises. Its longevity hints that shared governance, far from being a European import, may have been reinvented independently across cultures when circumstances demanded balance over domination. As modern democracies grapple with polarization, these silent stones hold quiet wisdom that the most enduring power structures aren't those that concentrate authority, but those that distribute it wisely enough to weather centuries of change. While Moscow grew powerful under the heavy hand of princes, a different political experiment was unfolding in the misty forests of medieval Russia's northwest. The Republic of Novgorod, a bustling hub of fur traders and honey merchants, operated under a system that would seem alien to most medieval societies. Its princes didn't inherit power, they answered to the people. At the heart of this arrangement stood the Vetch, a public assembly where bearded merchants in woolen cloaks and craftsmen with resin-stained hands gathered to debate laws and even dismiss rulers who failed them. Imagine the scene, a massive bell ringing across the frozen Volkhov River, summoning citizens to the square, where the fate of princes hung on shouted votes and raised hands. This wasn't just consultation, it was contractual governance, with written agreements specifying that rulers who violated terms could be shown the road back to wherever they came from. What set Novgorod apart was its paper trail. Thousands of birch bark letters preserved in the waterlogged soil reveal a society where political participation extended far beyond the elite. One fragment from the 1200s records a heated debate over bridge repairs, with taxpayers demanding itemized budgets. Another shows a woman named Nastasia suing her neighbor over a stolen necklace, not through some distant judge, but through a neighborhood assembly. These weren't just complaints, they were proof that ordinary Novgorodians saw governance as their right. Even more striking, archaeological finds include wooden voting tallies and wax seals from artisan guilds, suggesting structured electoral processes long before Magna Carta's ink dried. The Vetch's power rested on economic pragmatism. Novgorod's wealth came from controlling trade routes between the Baltic and Byzantine worlds, and its merchants understood that stability required shared decision-making. When princes overstepped, like Yaroslav of Tver in the 1300s, who tried imposing unpopular taxes, the assembly simply revoked his contract and invited a competitor. This created a marketplace of leadership where rulers competed to offer better governance. At its peak, the system even produced a written constitution called the Novgorod Justice, which limited aristocratic land grabs and protected smallholders' rights. Medieval antitrust laws born from collective bargaining. Yet the Republic's greatest innovation might have been its federal structure. Novgorod didn't just govern its walled city, it managed a vast hinterland through a network of subordinate vetches in towns like Pskov and Staraya Russa. These local assemblies sent delegates to the capital, creating a proto-federal system where peripheral voices could influence central policy. A 13th century treaty with German Hanseatic merchants specifies that trade disputes would be settled by joint panels of Russian and German representatives, an early form of transnational commercial arbitration. Moscow's eventual conquest in 1478 didn't just end Novgorod's independence, it actively erased its democratic memory. Ivan III dismantled the Vetch bell, symbolically silencing the Assembly's voice, while his grandson Ivan the Terrible later massacred the city's elites to crush any revival. But fragments of the tradition survived in unexpected ways. Some historians argue that the Cossack circles of later centuries, where warriors elected their atamans, carried echoes of Novgorod's ethos. Even the peasant-mere assemblies of Imperial Russia, which governed village land distribution, functioned as micro-versions of the Vetch principle, proof that the idea of grassroots governance couldn't be fully extinguished. The tragedy isn't just that Novgorod fell, but that its alternative vision for Russian development was so thoroughly overshadowed. Where Moscow built vertical power structures, Novgorod had fostered horizontal collaboration. Where Tsars later claimed divine right, Novgorod's princes understood they served at the people's pleasure. Today, as archaeologists piece together more birch bark messages, they're uncovering a lost chapter that challenges stereotypes about Russian political culture, one that proves even amidst medieval forests and freezing rivers, the human desire for self-determination finds ways to flourish. Nestled between snow-capped peaks and emerald valleys, Switzerland's democracy wasn't born in grand legislative halls. It emerged from the defiant spirit of alpine farmers who refused to kneel. In the 1300s, while most of Europe bowed to feudal lords, remote communities in Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden forged alliances that would become the Swiss Confederation. Their weapon, not swords or spears, but a radical idea that decisions should be made under open skies, with every free man's voice carrying equal weight. The Landsgemeinde, those legendary assemblies held in meadow circles, weren't just meetings. They were living theater of democracy, where men voted by raising halberds and elected judges by standing in designated rings. This was governance stripped bare of pomp, where the only throne was a hillside and the only crown was the trust of your neighbors. What made these alpine assemblies extraordinary was their blend of ritual and raw practicality. On appointed spring days, entire villages would trek to high pastures, forming human circles around a stone podium where elders recited ancestral laws from memory. Votes weren't whispered or written, they were roared to the heavens, with weapons raised like forest of steel saplings. Surviving engravings show men in simple wool tunics, their faces weathered by mountain winds, debating tax rates and land disputes with the same intensity as modern parliamentarians. The system's genius lay in its transparency. No backroom deals could survive when every decision unfolded before hundreds of armed witnesses. Even the election of judges followed an ingenious method. Candidates walked slowly around a marked area while supporters fell in step behind them, the longest human chain won. This wasn't democracy as philosophers envisioned it, but democracy as survival strategy. Isolated by geography, these communities needed collective buy-in for everything from avalanche defenses to pasture rotations. Chronicles from 1426 describe how the canton of Glarus resolved a bitter inheritance dispute not by royal decree, but by assigning 12 men from each valley to negotiate a compromise. When nobles from Habsburg tried imposing taxes, the response came not through petitions but through coordinated village referendums, a medieval version of grassroots lobbying. Over centuries, this stubborn insistence on local control crystallized into a system where even national decisions required majority approval from sovereign cantons, creating a federation held together by consent rather than coercion. The Swiss model's true innovation was its glacial pace of change. Where other democracies emerged from revolutions or collapses, Switzerland's grew like an alpine pine, slowly, stubbornly, adapting to each contour of the political landscape. The Landsgemeinde endured into the 19th century, only fading when populations grew too large for open-air voting. But their spirit lived on in Switzerland's famed direct democracy tools, initiatives, referendums, and the right to recall officials. That deep-seated skepticism of concentrated power still shapes Swiss politics today, where even constitutional amendments can be overturned by popular vote and cabinet ministers rotate presidency annually to prevent cults of personality. Modern observers often miss the radicalism beneath the Swiss system's orderly surface. In an age when democracy is often reduced to occasional voting, Switzerland preserves the medieval Alpine belief that true self-rule means constant participation. The Landsgemeinde's legacy isn't just in procedures, it's in the cultural expectation that governance should be visible, audible, and accountable to the last mountain pasture. As contemporary democracies grapple with disengagement and centralization, those long-ago farmers remind us that the strongest foundations aren't laid in marble halls, but on wind-swept meadows where every voice can stir the air. While Europe's queens ruled through dynastic accidents and Athenian women were barred from politics entirely, the Hordnocony were perfecting a system where female leadership wasn't the exception, it was the foundation. Clan mothers, respected elders chosen for their wisdom, held authority that would shock Enlightenment philosophers. They nominated every male chief, conducted his inauguration ceremony, and monitored his conduct with the power to remove him if he failed his duties. Picture the scene, a woman approaching a wayward leader, placing a deerskin over his shoulders as a warning. If he didn't change course, she'd return, this time removing the hide with a single phrase, "You are no longer chief." No courts, no coups, just the quiet assertion that leadership flowed from community trust, not divine right. This matrilineal structure extended far beyond political appointments. Women controlled the very lifeblood of Hordnocony society, the farmland. Unlike European systems where men inherited property, long houses and cultivated fields passed from mother to daughter, giving women economic leverage that translated into political influence. Jesuit missionaries in the 1600s recorded their bewilderment at councils where men would pause debates to consult female elders, noting, "The real power lies with the women who own the land and the harvest." When war loomed, it was often the clan mothers who decided whether to supply warriors with provisions, a de facto veto over military campaigns. The system's sophistication becomes clear when contrasted with contemporary European norms. While English common law declared women civilly dead upon marriage, Hordnocony women retained full legal autonomy. Divorce could be initiated by either party, with children and belongings remaining with the mother's clan. Domestic violence was so rare that early European settlers assumed the Hordnocony had no concept of it until realizing their laws punished such acts with public shaming and restitution payments to the victim's family. Even bodily autonomy was respected. Historical accounts describe clan mothers distributing herbal contraceptives to women who wished to delay childbearing, a level of reproductive agency unimaginable in colonial societies. What truly astonishes isn't just that this system existed, but how deliberately it was designed. Oral histories recount how the peacemaker, the legendary figure who founded the Iroquois Confederacy, insisted on gender balance as a safeguard against tyranny. Clan mothers weren't arbitrary rulers, they were selected for demonstrated judgment, often after decades of observing community conflicts and mentoring younger women. Their role wasn't to dominate men, but to ensure leaders governed with the next 7 generations in mind, a concept modern sustainability advocates are only now embracing. The bitter irony lies in how colonial encounters unfolded. While European intellectuals like Locke and Rousseau theorized about social contracts, they ignored living examples like the Hordnocony, dismissing their system as savage despite its advanced checks and balances. Early American feminists like Matilda Joslyn Gage did recognize the model, citing it in suffrage speeches, but their male peers largely ignored the precedent. Even today, as Canada and the US grapple with gender parity in politics, few acknowledge that the solution might lie not in futuristic policies, but in traditions that predate the Magna Carta. Perhaps the most enduring lesson is how the Hordnocony viewed power, not as a pyramid to climb, but as a bundle of responsibilities to share. Clan mothers didn't seek glory, they cultivated discernment. Chiefs weren't born to rule, they earned trust through service. In an era where Western democracies still struggle with gender gaps in leadership, those longhouse fires whisper a radical truth. That true balance isn't about privileging one group over another, but about recognizing that good governance requires all voices, and that sometimes the wisest way forward is to listen to those who have been nurturing the future all along. Deep in the forests of Western India, where the sun filters through teak leaves and the air hums with cicadas, the Bhil tribes have preserved a form of democracy untouched by parchment or parliaments. Their panchayats, village councils older than the Roman Senate, operate on a principle that modern legal systems often struggle to emulate, that justice should heal rather than punish. Picture a moonlit clearing where the entire village gathers, not to spectate but to participate. An elder, chosen for wisdom rather than wealth, guides discussions until every perspective is heard. There are no gavels here, no bailiffs, just the collective memory of generations ensuring fairness survives in whispers and nods. What makes the Bhil system extraordinary is how it transforms conflict into community. When disputes arise over land, marriage, or stolen livestock, the panchayat doesn't impose verdicts from above. Instead, elders facilitate dialogues where accuser and accused speak freely, often for hours, until mutual understanding emerges. Anthropologists recorded a case where two farmers arguing over a mango tree's boundary weren't assigned blame, but guided to a solution where one tended the tree while the other harvested fruit, splitting proceeds annually. This wasn't mere compromise, it was conflict resolution designed to preserve relationships in a society where everyone depended on everyone else. The British colonial encounter reveals just how sophisticated these oral democracies were. 19th century administrators, convinced their legal codes were superior, were baffled to find Bhil villages resolving complex inheritance cases without written records. One officer's journal describes a panchayat untangling a decade-long feud using only memorized kinship trees and precedents recited from memory, a feat requiring mental rigor any courtroom would envy. When outsiders tried replacing these councils with colonial courts, they inadvertently proved the system's resilience. Case backlogs ballooned as villagers boycotted alien procedures, forcing the British to grudgingly recognize panchayats in certain jurisdictions. At the heart of Bhil governance lies a radical idea that leadership means listening first. Council heads, called patels, earn authority through demonstrated fairness, not birthright. Women often serve as key witnesses in disputes. Their testimonies weighted equally despite patriarchal norms in surrounding societies. Decisions hinge not on majority votes, but on consensus building that continues until objections are addressed. Modern ethnographers observed a land dispute where deliberations stretched over 3 nights because one elder insisted, "If we hurry, someone will leave feeling broken." That commitment to collective harmony built systems so trusted. Historical records show neighboring Hindu and Muslim villages sometimes voluntarily submitting to Bhil panchayats for impartial judgment. The tragedy of colonial disruption wasn't just political, it eroded ecological wisdom embedded in these councils. Bil panchayats traditionally regulated forest use through intricate seasonal rules, preventing overharvesting by consensus. When British timber contracts overrode these practices, deforestation followed. Yet even today, in remote pockets of Rajasthan and Gujarat, the old ways persist. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Bil villages organized quarantine measures and food distribution through revived panchayats, outperforming state efforts in some regions. Their secret, a governance model that treats emergencies not as disruptions to authority, but as moments to reaffirm mutual responsibility. This living tradition offers urgent lessons for modern democracies. Where our systems often amplify division through adversarial politics, the Bil model seeks unity through patient dialogue. Where we prioritize speed and efficiency in justice, they value restoration over retribution. Most importantly, they remind us that democracy doesn't require bureaucracy to thrive. Sometimes, it just needs a circle of faces under the stars, speaking and listening until balance is found. As digital age societies grapple with polarization, these forest councils whisper an ancient truth, that the best governance grows not from control, but from the hard, sacred work of understanding one another. Beneath the turquoise waters of the Aegean, where sunlight dances on ancient ruins, lies one of history's most tantalizing democratic mysteries. The Minoan palaces of Crete, Knossos, Phaistos, Malia, stand as architectural marvels without the usual trappings of autocratic rule. No grand tombs for warrior kings, no monuments celebrating conquest, just labyrinthine corridors leading to rooms that seem designed for gathering rather than commanding. Archaeologists have long puzzled over who governed this sophisticated Bronze Age society, and the emerging answer upends everything we expect from ancient power structures. It might have been councils of priestesses guiding their people through trade networks and sacred rituals rather than decrees and swords. Walk through the reconstructed halls of Knossos today, and the absence speaks volumes. While Egyptian temples scream of pharaonic dominance and Mesopotamian ziggurats proclaim priestly authority, Minoan frescoes whisper of something subtler. Vibrant murals depict processions of women bearing ceremonial vessels, their elaborate dresses and serene expressions suggesting ritual leadership. Men appear as athletes leaping over bulls or sailors transporting goods, not as armored conquerors. Most strikingly, not a single battle scene adorns these walls, an anomaly in an era when other civilizations glorified war, the closest thing to a royal portrait. The so-called Prince of the Lilies, whose gender scholars now debate, depicted gathering flowers rather than wielding weapons. This wasn't just art, it was a visual manifesto of values prioritizing harmony over hierarchy. The evidence extends beyond artwork. Linear, a tablet still undeciphered hint at meticulous record-keeping of trade goods rather than tribute payments. Storerooms overflowed not with seized treasures, but with saffron, olive oil, and exquisitely crafted pottery destined for ports across the Mediterranean. Unlike contemporary empires that grew through military expansion, Minoan influence spread through what archaeologists call soft power, cultural exchange, and economic interdependence. Their palaces, with their advanced drainage systems and communal spaces, functioned more like redistributive hubs than fortified seats of domination. Imagine a society where governance meant ensuring fair access to resources rather than hoarding them behind palace walls. Then there's the enigma of the throne rooms. The famous alabaster seat at Knossos, often sensationalized as King Mino's throne, sits in a chamber too small for imperial audiences. Recent reconstructions suggest it was part of a larger ritual complex where initiates, possibly priestesses, engaged in ceremonial dialogues. Nearby, sunken basins and sacred horns point to spaces designed for collective purification, rites rather than unilateral proclamations. Some scholars now propose these were council chambers where religious and commercial leaders negotiated decisions through consensus, blending spiritual authority with pragmatic trade needs. The system's fragility became its historical undoing. When the thorough eruption devastated Crete around 1600 BCE, followed by Mycenaean invasions, the Minoan model collapsed beneath waves of violence and upheaval. Later Greek myths would reduce this complex civilization to minotaurs and labyrinthine prisons, erasing its collaborative spirit, yet fragments of its legacy survived. Some historians trace Athenian thesmothetai early lawgivers who derived authority from ritual knowledge to Minoan precedents. Others see echoes in the shared governance of classical Greek city-states like Gortyn, where priestesses retained significant judicial powers. What makes the Minoan example so haunting is its unanswered questions. Without deciphered records, we'll never know exactly how their councils functioned or why they avoided militarism in a brutal age. But their ruins offer a provocative counter-narrative that ancient societies could flourish through cooperation rather than coercion, that leadership might have once meant facilitating exchange rather than enforcing obedience. In a world still obsessed with strongman rulers, these silent palaces challenge us to imagine alternatives, proving that even in the shadows of volcanoes, the human impulse toward collective governance finds ways to bloom. 17th on our journey takes us to the dense forests of the Great Lakes region, where the Huron Confederacy wove together dozens of villages into a political tapestry unlike anything Europeans had encountered. At first glance, Jesuit missionaries saw only savages living in longhouses, but beneath that surface thrived a sophisticated trade democracy that balanced autonomy with collective decision-making. Picture this: villages specializing in corn, fishing, or tool production, their surplus flowing along well-established trade routes in birchbark canoes, while council fires burned late into the night debating policies that would affect tens of thousands. What stunned European observers wasn't just the scale, but the structure where captives from rival tribes could rise to full voting rights, where women held veto power over war declarations, and where consensus wasn't just preferred but required. The Huron system revolved around two revolutionary principles: economic interdependence and earned inclusion. Unlike European feudal systems where birth determined status, Huron villages granted political voice based on contribution to the collective good. Jesuit records describe captive Iroquois warriors, initially brought as prisoners, eventually speaking in councils once they'd proven their commitment to the community. One missionary's letter from 1642 expresses shock at seeing a former enemy, now sitting as an equal, his counsel weighed as gravely as any born Huron. This fluid citizenship stood in stark contrast to Europe's rigid class structures, where even wealthy merchants couldn't buy noble privileges. Trade wasn't just commerce, it was the glue of governance. The famous Huronia trade network stretched from the St. Lawrence to the Mississippi, with goods like copper, flint, and tobacco moving alongside ideas and alliances. Village councils didn't just regulate prices, they managed relationships, appointing peace chiefs to negotiate with distant partners and war chiefs only when diplomacy failed. French traders initially assumed these titles indicated permanent rulers, until witnessing a war chief being publicly stripped of authority after violating consensus, a concept as foreign to Louis Roman XIV France as democracy itself. Women's roles particularly baffled European observers. While French wives needed male guardians to sign contracts, Huron women controlled longhouse resources and harvest distribution. Clan mothers nominated male representatives to confederacy councils and could recall them for misconduct. One Jesuit account describes a council abruptly adjourning because the women refused to provision the men for war, effectively blocking a military campaign through economic veto. This gender balance created checks on impulsive decisions where European kings could wage wars that devastated populations. Huron actions required alignment across multiple layers of society. The system's brilliance became its vulnerability when smallpox ravaged Huronia in the 1630s, killing up to half the population. The very consensus model that had ensured stability now hindered rapid crisis response. Neighboring Iroquois, with more centralized wartime authority, exploited this weakness. Yet even in decline, the Huron legacy endured. Elements of their confederacy model influenced the later Iroquois League, while their trade protocols shaped indigenous European alliances for centuries. Modern scholars see echoes in cooperative movements and fair trade networks prove that their vision of economics and governance as intertwined threads wasn't primitive but prescient. What makes the Huron experiment so vital to rediscover isn't just its sophistication, but its radical redefinition of belonging. In an age when nations build walls and restrict citizenship, their example whispers an alternative. That true community isn't about bloodlines or borders, but about the willingness to contribute and deliberate as equals. Those longhouse fires held a flame not just for warmth, but for a vision of democracy where every voice could find its place in the circle, if it spoke with wisdom and acted with care. Rising from the highlands of Ethiopia like stone sentinels, the towering stelae of Axum tell a story few expect from ancient Africa, not just of kings and conquests, but of laws etched in stone for all to see. These massive obelisks, some reaching 70 feet tall, weren't mere monuments. They were the ancient world's version of a public legal database, inscribed with decrees that reveal a startling truth. Axumite kings ruled not by divine fiat, but through a delicate dance with noble assemblies. Imagine standing in the shadow of these stelae 2,000 years ago, watching as scribes translated royal pledges into J's script, ensuring every farmer and merchant knew their rights and their rulers' promises. What made Axum's system remarkable was its implied social contract. Unlike Egyptian pharaohs who claimed to be living gods, Axumite monarchs minted coins proclaiming themselves king of the Axumites, a subtle but profound acknowledgement that their authority derived from the people they governed. Surviving inscriptions describe councils of nobles called Mequanint, debating taxation policies and military campaigns before presenting recommendations to the throne. 1/3 century stele records a king pledging to lower grain taxes after listening to the grievances of the elders, while another details infrastructure projects approved only after consultation with the people's representatives. This wasn't autocracy softened by occasional advice. It was governance built on reciprocal obligation. The legal sophistication becomes clear when you examine Axum's trade regulations. As the hub of an empire stretching from Yemen to Sudan, Axum needed systems to manage diverse merchants, Arab traders, Egyptian shipbuilders, Nubian gold dealers. Their stelae prescribed standardized weights and measures, with penalties for fraud carved in explicit detail. One decree warns that any merchant caught tampering with scales would forfeit his goods to the injured party and pay silver to the crown, blending restitution with state oversight. Another establishes protocols for foreign traders, guaranteeing protection if they obey the laws of the marketplace. These weren't arbitrary rules, they were the foundation of an economic ecosystem where fairness equaled prosperity. Axum's greatest innovation might have been its blend of permanence and adaptability. While the stelae recorded core laws in immutable stone, oral traditions suggest regular assemblies revisited interpretations. Portuguese missionary accounts from the 16th century describe witnessing descendant courts still referencing the ancient inscriptions while adjusting applications for new circumstances, a living legal tradition spanning over a millennium. Even their famous Azana stone, marking the kingdom's conversion to Christianity in the 4th century, frames the religious shift not as a top-down decree, but as a collective decision discussed with the nobles and the people. The tragedy lies in how little credit Axum's system receives in mainstream histories. While Magna Carta is celebrated as democracy's dawn, Axum's stele predated by 800 years with similar principles of constrained monarchy. Their model influenced later Ethiopian imperial governance, where emperors like Zara Yacob in the 15th century still convened keen debates, requiring elite consensus for major decisions. Modern Ethiopia's federalist structure, balancing regional autonomy with central authority, carries faint echoes of those ancient negotiations between kings and councils. Those weathered stelae, now UNESCO-protected relics, hold a lesson modern democracies often forget. That legitimacy comes not from unchallenged authority, but from visible accountability. Where other kingdoms built palaces to intimidate, Axum erected stone billboards broadcasting their social contract. In an era where leaders often govern through opacity and shifting promises, these ancient monoliths whisper that true power endures when carved in stone and honored in practice. In the turbulent twilight of Rome's empire, as barbarian kingdoms carved up Europe, an unexpected democratic experiment flickered to life in the sun-baked heart of Iberia. The Visigothic councils of Toledo 18, monumental gatherings between 500 and 700 CE, defied every stereotype of the so-called Dark Ages. Picture this: warrior kings presiding not from isolated thrones, but in raucous assemblies where bishops argued with nobles over peasant rights, and Jewish scholars advised on legal reforms. These weren't the rubber-stamp councils of later medieval Europe. They were vibrant debates that produced laws protecting tenant farmers from eviction, regulating fair wages, and even prohibiting forced conversions of Jews' radical notions in an age of autocracy. What made these councils extraordinary was their improbable inclusivity. While Visigothic kings held nominal authority, real power flowed from the collaborative process. Bishops drafted legislation, nobles amended proposals, and royal decrees required ratification by the assembly, a system closer to constitutional monarchy than feudal tyranny. The Fourth Council of Toledo in 633 went further, declaring that even kings couldn't levy taxes without consultation, a principle Magna Carta would echo 6 centuries later. Surviving manuscripts show meticulous voting records, with dissenting opinions preserved alongside majority rulings, an early form of judicial transparency. One law code explicitly states that judges must consider the customs of the Romans and the Jews alongside Visigothic traditions, creating a legal pluralism unheard of in contemporary Europe. The crowning achievement was the Liber Judicarum, compiled in 654, which reads like a medieval Bill of Rights. It banned collective punishment, ensured fair trials for enslaved people seeking freedom, and mandated that peasant grievances be heard by mixed juries of landowners and tenants. Jewish communities, though periodically pressured, maintained legal protections for synagogues and commerce rights that would vanish after the Muslim conquest. The code's sophistication startles modern scholars. Its provisions on debt relief and property disputes feel startlingly contemporary, with one clause requiring lenders to swear upon their souls they hadn't manipulated interest rates. Yet the system's fragility became apparent as the Muslim advance loomed. later councils degenerated into factional squabbles, with nobles exploiting the framework to undermine weak kings. When Tariq ibn Ziyad's armies crossed the Strait of Gibraltar in 711, they didn't just topple a kingdom. They buried a unique experiment in blending Germanic, Roman, and Judeo-Christian legal traditions. But echoes lingered. Mozarabic Christians preserved copies of the Liber Judicarum, which resurfaced in Christian Spain's medieval fueros local charters granting towns self-governance. Some historians trace elements of Portugal's early courts assemblies to Toledo's precedent, while the Sayat Partidars, Alfonso X's groundbreaking legal code, borrowed liberally from Visigothic concepts of equitable justice. The true tragedy isn't that this system fell, but that its legacy was so thoroughly overshadowed by later narratives casting the Visigoths as crude oppressors. Those council records tell a different story of warriors who traded battlefield customs for parliamentary procedure, of bishops who saw lawmaking as sacred duty, of a society that briefly held autocracy at bay through collective deliberation. In an age where democracy is often framed as purely Athenian or Enlightenment-born, Toledo's dusty manuscripts whisper a reminder that even in history's darkest corners, the human yearning for fair governance finds light. The vast Pacific stretches like an endless blue canvas, but to the Polynesian voyagers who settled its scattered islands, every current and star told a story of collective destiny. While European explorers sailed under the banners of kings, Polynesian canoe fleets moved to a different rhythm, one where navigators earned their place through tested skill, not noble blood, and where entire communities decided together when and where to seek new shores. Imagine setting sail with no maps, no compasses, just generations of ocean knowledge passed down through chance, where the fate of families and livestock balanced on the ability to read wave patterns and bird flights, and then deciding as a group whether to turn back or press onward into the unknown. This wasn't conquest, it was consensus in motion. What set Polynesian exploration apart was its fusion of individual brilliance and communal wisdom. Master navigators, called PWO in some traditions, underwent decades of training to memorize star paths, swell patterns, and the subtle clues of bioluminescence that marked distant atolls. Yet their authority wasn't absolute, it was granted by the communities they served. Hawaiian oral histories describe lengthy deliberations before voyages, where families debated provisions, assessed risks, and sometimes voted to delay departures until seasons or omens aligned. When canoes finally launched, they traveled in fleets, with decisions en route made through council discussions under the stars. A navigator might guide the way, but turning points were collective choices, often signaled by conch shell calls between vessels. The environmental intelligence baked into this system was staggering. Unlike European colonizers who often imposed rigid plans on new lands, Polynesian settlers adapted strategies through continuous feedback. Maori traditions speak of Wakapapa meetings upon reaching Aotearoa, New Zealand, where explorers assessed ecosystems before deciding where to settle, moving inland only after confirming coastal resources could sustain initial camps. In the Marquesas, archaeological evidence shows deliberate introductions of crops and animals sequenced to prevent soil depletion, reflecting decisions made not by chiefs alone, but by gardening guilds and fishing clans. This wasn't just navigation, it was participatory land use planning at oceanic scale. The contrast with contemporary European models couldn't be starker. Where Spanish caravels carried conquistadors who claimed lands by sword and cross, Polynesian canoes transported entire ecosystems, taro shoots, breadfruit saplings, and pregnant animals as investments in shared futures. Where European voyagers often sought to extract wealth for distant monarchs, Polynesian expansions aimed to create self-sustaining communities from the outset. Cook Island legends recount how founding parties included not just warriors, but healers, storytellers, and soil experts, a cross-section of skills chosen through community nomination rather than royal appointment. The legacy of this collaborative exploration lives on in modern Pacific governance. Traditional Phono councils still guide village decisions from Samoa to Tahiti, blending ancient participatory models with contemporary need. When Tonga transitioned toward constitutional monarchy in 2010, debates echoed ancestral voyage deliberations, weighing stability against innovation. Even Hawaii's sovereignty movements draw on voyaging traditions, using the resurgence of double-hulled canoe building as a metaphor for reclaiming collective decision-making. Those ancient wayfinders understood something we're still relearning, that sustainable exploration requires both expert knowledge and communal consent. Their canoes weren't just vessels of wood and fiber, they were floating democracies, proving that the most audacious journeys aren't those commanded by lone heroes, but those steered by many hands reading the same stars. As we face our own uncharted waters, climate shifts, resource strains, their example whispers across centuries. Progress needn't mean conquest, and the best destinations are those we choose together. From the carefully planned streets of Mohenjo-Daro to the consensus-building circles of the Iroquois, one truth emerges with startling clarity: democracy wasn't born in a single city, but sparked to life again and again wherever people sought to govern themselves. These 20 hidden chapters of history don't just expand our timeline, they shatter the very definition of what democracy can be. The Indus Valley's neighborhood assemblies prove it doesn't require marble columns. The Bil Panchayats show it thrives without written constitutions. The Polynesian voyagers remind us it can even sail across oceans, built not in legislative halls but on the decks of canoes navigating by shared stars. What unites these disparate systems isn't procedure but principle. The Huron confederacies earned inclusion, the Carthaginian suffetes accountability, the Icelandic Althing's trust-based order all point to a universal human truth, that power works best when distributed, checked, and constantly renewed by those it serves. Modern democracies, for all their sophistication, often forget these ancient lessons. We've built towering institutions but sometimes lost the village-scale accountability that made build justice so personal. We celebrate majority rule but overlook the Hordnocony requirement to address every dissenting voice. We debate term limits while ignoring the Celtic model where leadership was situational, returning warriors to their fields once their expertise was no longer needed. The most urgent revelation isn't just historical, it's practical. As contemporary democracies grapple with polarization, these examples offer unexpected tools. Imagine adapting the Minoan soft power approach to international relations, or applying Sri Lanka's water democracy to climate policy. Picture modern legislatures borrowing the Visigothic practice of recording dissenting opinions alongside laws, or corporations adopting Phoenician-style rotating leadership to prevent power hoarding. These aren't nostalgic fantasies, they're proven strategies that sustained societies through volcanic eruptions, invasions, and social upheavals far more severe than our current challenges. That's the real gift of these forgotten democracies, not just correcting our historical narrative, but expanding our political imagination. They prove there have always been alternatives to autocracy and majoritarian tyranny, that human communities are endlessly creative in balancing freedom with collective survival. The next time someone claims democracy is fragile or unnatural, point them to the Iroquois Confederacy's 1,000-year endurance, or the Icelandic Althing's rebirth after centuries of suppression. The desire to shape our shared rules isn't a cultural accident, it's coded into our species. So let's keep asking the uncomfortable questions these examples raise. Why did we embrace Athens' exclusionary model but ignore the Bil Panchayat's restorative justice? How might history have changed if Carthage's merchant democracy had survived Rome's salt? What wisdom still lies buried in untranslated Minoan tablets or undeciphered Indus scripts? The answers matter not just for understanding our past, but for reimagining our future. Because the most important lesson from these 20 surprises is this: democracy was never meant to be one thing, perfected in one place. It's an evolving conversation, and everyone, from Mohenjo-Daro's planners to Polynesia's star readers, deserves a seat at that table. Your voice belongs there too. Which of these ancient experiments speaks most powerfully to our modern moment? Share your perspective below, and let's keep this conversation going. For more journeys into history's overlooked breakthroughs, subscribe and join us as we keep rediscovering the many roots of the people.